Story 1. Pittsburgh always had these old places, buildings that stood empty and broken, like teeth missing from a smile. We called them ruins. Me and my friend, Marco, we liked to go explore them. Not because we were tough or anything, but because they felt like secrets, places the city forgot. One Saturday, the sky was gray like old dishwater, the kind of day that makes you want to stay inside. But Marco called, all excited. "Hey, Keith," he said, his voice buzzing like a trapped fly. "I found a new one. Down by the river, near that old steel mill. They say it was a factory, made glass or something. Abandoned for years." I wasn't really feeling it, but Marco was my best friend. "All right," I sighed. "Give me an hour." We met near the bridge, the air smelling like wet metal and something else, something dusty and old. The factory wasn't hard to find. It was a big, brick building, most of the windows smashed out, like vacant eyes staring at the sky. A rusty fence leaned around it, but there were holes big enough to walk through. "This is it," Marco said, a grin on his face. He was always happy to find a new place to explore. We slipped through a gap in the fence. The ground inside was covered in broken glass and weeds pushing up through cracks in the concrete. The main doors were gone, just a dark, gaping hole in the wall. It felt like walking into the mouth of something big and dead. Inside, it was darker than I thought it would be. The air was thick and still, like dust had settled and never moved. Sunlight squeezed in through the broken windows, making stripes on the floor. We walked slowly, our feet crunching on the debris. The main part of the factory was huge, a big open space with tall ceilings. There were old machines everywhere, big and heavy, covered in rust. Pipes ran along the walls and ceilings, some broken and hanging down. It was like a giant had thrown its toys around and then left. "Wow," Marco whispered, looking around. "Imagine all the work that went on in here." We walked deeper, exploring different parts of the factory. There were smaller rooms with desks tipped over and papers scattered on the floor, like someone had left in a hurry. In one room, we found old calendars on the wall, the dates from years ago. It felt strange, like stepping back in time. After a while, we started hearing noises. Not big, scary noises, just little sounds. A creak here, a rustle there. The wind probably, or maybe some animals had made their home inside. But it made me a little uneasy. The silence of the place was heavy, and these small sounds felt like something was moving in the shadows. "Did you hear that?" I asked Marco, stopping. He listened for a second. "Yeah, just the old building settling, I guess." We kept going, trying to be quiet ourselves. The deeper we went, the darker it got. We used our phone flashlights to see ahead. The beams danced on the walls, making the shadows jump and twist. Then we found another room, smaller than the others. It smelled different in here, not just dust and rust. There was a stale, musty smell, like old clothes and something else I couldn't quite place. In the corner of the room, there was a pile of blankets and some old bags. It looked like someone was living here. "Whoa," Marco said softly. "Looks like someone's been staying here." We felt a little weird. This wasn't just an empty building anymore. Someone had made it their home. We should probably leave them alone. As we turned to go, we heard a noise from the back of the room. A cough. It wasn't a normal cough, it was wet and deep, like someone was sick. We froze, our flashlights pointed at the pile of blankets. "Hello?" Marco called out, his voice a little shaky. There was no answer, just silence for a moment. Then we heard another cough, closer this time. Slowly, a figure started to rise from the blankets. It was hunched over, wrapped in dirty clothes. We couldn't see its face, it was hidden in the shadows. My heart started to beat faster. This wasn't just some homeless person looking for shelter. There was something about the way this figure moved, the way it stayed in the shadows, that felt wrong. We didn't know anyone was here, I said quickly, trying to sound calm. We were just exploring. We'll leave now. The figure didn't move, didn't say anything. It just stood there, hunched over, in the dim light. Then, it started to move. Slowly, it turned its head. We still couldn't see its face, but we could feel its eyes on us. It felt like something cold was looking right through me. Suddenly, another figure moved from the shadows in the corner. This one was bigger, taller. It stepped in front of the first one, blocking our view. This one we could see a little better. He had a long, dirty beard and his eyes were hard and mean. He was holding something in his hand, a piece of metal pipe. "What do you want?" he growled, his voice rough. Marco and I didn't say anything. We just stared at him, our fear growing. "You shouldn't be here," he said, taking a step closer. We started to back away slowly. "We're leaving," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We didn't mean any trouble. The big man didn't move. He just watched us, his eyes never leaving ours. The first figure was still behind him, silent and still in the shadows. We turned and ran. We didn't care about being quiet anymore. We just wanted to get out of that factory. We ran through the big open room, past the silent machines, towards the hole in the wall that was our way out. I could hear them behind us, their footsteps echoing in the empty building. The sound of the pipe hitting against something metal made me run even faster. We burst out of the factory and into the gray daylight. We didn't stop running until we were far away, back on the main road, our lungs burning. We didn't talk much after that. We just walked, trying to catch our breath. When we finally stopped, Marco looked at me, his face pale. "What do you think they were doing in there?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't know. And I don't want to find out." We never went back to that factory. We found other ruins to explore, but none of them felt the same. There was always a little bit of that fear, that feeling of something hidden in the shadows, that stayed with me. The thought of those figures, silent and still in the darkness, still gives me chills. Pittsburgh has a lot of old secrets, and some of them are better left undisturbed. Story 2. Years later, I found myself in Germany for work. I had a few days off, and I decided to do some exploring. I'd always been interested in history, and Germany had a lot of it, some of it dark and fascinating. I read about an old military complex, not far from where I was staying. It was supposed to be mostly underground, a series of tunnels and rooms built a long time ago. Some people said it was used during the wars, maybe even earlier. It was abandoned now, of course, and supposedly off limits. But that just made it more interesting. I drove out there one afternoon, the German countryside green and peaceful under a clear sky. The entrance to the complex was hidden in a small patch of woods. There was a rusty gate with a sign in German that I didn't fully understand, but the keep out part was pretty clear. I climbed over the gate anyway. The air inside the woods felt cooler, the sunlight filtered through the leaves. I followed a narrow path that led down into the ground. Soon, I was standing in front of a heavy, metal door, half buried in the earth. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible inside. I pushed it open carefully. It groaned like an old beast disturbed from its sleep. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying the smell of earth and something else, something ancient and stale. I stepped inside. It was pitch black. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. I was in a narrow tunnel, the walls made of rough-hewn stone. The ceiling was low, and I had to duck my head. The tunnel sloped downwards, and I followed it, the only sound the echo of my own footsteps. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. It felt like I was going deeper and deeper into the earth's belly. The tunnel opened into a larger room, a kind of underground chamber. The ceiling was higher here, supported by thick stone pillars. There were openings in the walls, leading to other tunnels and rooms. It was like a maze down here. I moved slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping across the walls. The stone was damp and mossy in places. There were markings on the walls, some looked like carvings, others like they were made with paint, but they were too faded to make out clearly. As I explored, I started to get a strange feeling. It wasn't just the cold or the darkness. It was like I wasn't alone down here. I kept feeling like there was something just out of the corner of my eye, something moving in the shadows. I stopped and listened. There was only the sound of my own breathing, the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. But the feeling persisted. I moved on, trying to tell myself it was just my imagination, the darkness playing tricks on my eyes. I went through more tunnels, each one feeling the same, cold and damp and silent. Then, as I turned a corner, I saw something. Just for a split second, a dark shape at the end of the tunnel. It was tall and thin, and it seemed to melt back into the shadows as soon as I shone my light on it. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. What was that? Was it just a trick of the light? Or had I really seen something? I held my breath and listened. Silence. I slowly moved forward, my flashlight beam fixed on the end of the tunnel. There was nothing there. Just the cold stone walls and the darkness. I told myself it was just my eyes playing games. The darkness down here was disorienting. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every time I turned a corner, I felt a prickle of fear, like someone was hiding just out of sight. I explored more of the complex. I found more rooms, some with old metal bunks still standing, others with piles of rubble on the floor. There were even some old pieces of equipment, rusted and broken. It felt like the people who had been here had left in a hurry. In one of the larger rooms, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into one of the stone walls were symbols. They weren't letters or numbers. They looked like some kind of strange, unsettling drawings. There were circles with lines through them, and other shapes I didn't recognize. They felt ancient and somehow evil. I took a picture of them with my phone, my hand shaking slightly. I didn't like the way they made me feel. As I continued, the feeling of being watched intensified. I started seeing things again, fleeting glimpses of movement in the shadows. Once, I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, but when I focused on the spot, there was nothing there. I was starting to get really creeped out. This place had a bad feeling to it, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. I decided it was time to leave. I started to make my way back the way I had come, retracing my steps through the maze of tunnels. But somehow, I got turned around. All the tunnels looked the same, the cold stone walls stretching into the darkness. I pulled out my phone to use the GPS, but there was no signal down here. I was alone, lost in the dark underground. Panic started to rise in my chest. I kept walking, choosing tunnels at random, hoping to find my way back to the entrance. Then, I saw another figure. This time, it was clearer. It was standing at the end of a tunnel, just out of the beam of my flashlight. It looked like a person, tall and gaunt, but it was too still, too silent. As I moved my light towards it, it seemed to shift, to blend into the shadows. When my light reached the spot where it had been, there was nothing there. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I knew I wasn't imagining things anymore. There was something else down here with me. I started to walk faster, my heart pounding. I had to get out of this place. I kept seeing them, these fleeting figures in the shadows. Sometimes I would just catch a glimpse of a dark shape around a corner, other times I would see them standing still at the end of a tunnel, watching me. They never made a sound, never moved when I shone my light on them. They just seemed to fade back into the darkness. The feeling of being watched was constant now, like unseen eyes were following my every move. The air felt heavy, and I could almost hear whispers in the silence, though I couldn't make out any words. I stumbled through the tunnels, my fear growing with every shadow I saw. I didn't know what these things were, but I knew they weren't normal. They felt old, malevolent. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint light ahead. It was the sliver of daylight coming from the entrance door. I ran towards it, my legs aching, my lungs burning. I burst out of the metal door and into the fresh air, blinking in the sunlight. I didn't stop running until I was out of the woods and back on the road. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that underground place. I never went back to that old military complex. I tried to forget what I had seen down there, but the memory of those silent figures in the shadows, those strange symbols on the wall, still haunts my dreams. Germany has its beautiful history, but it also has its dark secrets, hidden deep beneath the earth. And some secrets are best left buried. Story 3. Back home, me and my friends, we had this thing. Sometimes, when we were bored and looking for a thrill, we go hang out at the old cemetery on the edge of town late at night. It wasn't really scary during the day, just a quiet place with old stones and trees. But at night, with the shadows and the silence, it felt different. There was me, Lee, and my friends Sarah, Ben, and Chloe. We weren't bad kids, just maybe a little too curious. One Friday night, after a movie, Ben suggested it. "Hey, you guys want to go to the cemetery?" he asked, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Seriously, Ben, again?" Chloe shrugged. "I don't know, it's kind of creepy." I was on the fence. I'd been there a few times before, and nothing had ever really happened. But there was always that little bit of unease, that feeling that we were somewhere we shouldn't be. "Come on," Ben said. "It'll be fun. We can tell ghost stories." In the end, we all agreed. We grabbed some flashlights and a blanket and drove out to the cemetery. It was a clear night, the moon hanging high in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows from the tombstones. The air was cool and still, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of traffic. We found a spot near a big, old oak tree in the middle of the cemetery and spread out the blanket. The tombstones around us looked like silent, watchful figures in the moonlight. We started telling stories, mostly silly ones at first, trying to make each other laugh. But as the night went on, the stories got darker, more serious. We talked about the people buried there, wondering what their lives had been like, what secrets they had taken to their graves. Then, around midnight, things started to feel different. The wind seemed to die down, and the silence became heavier, almost like a pressure in the air. "Did you hear that?" Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. We all stopped talking and listened. There was nothing. "Just the wind," Ben said, but he sounded a little unsure. A few minutes later, we heard it again. A soft, scraping sound, like something was dragging across the ground. It seemed to come from the far end of the cemetery, near the old stone wall. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. Ben shone his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam only reached the nearest tombstones. We couldn't see anything beyond them. We waited, holding our breath. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like something heavy was being pulled. "Maybe it's just an animal," I said, trying to sound brave, but my heart was starting to beat faster. Then, we heard another sound. A low moan, like someone in pain. It was faint, but it was definitely there. Chloe grabbed Sarah's arm. "I don't like this," she whispered. "Maybe we should go." Ben was still shining his flashlight around, his face pale in the moonlight. "Wait," he said. "Let's just see what it is." The moaning sound came again, louder this time. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere nearby, behind one of the larger tombstones. We all stood up, our flashlights pointed in the direction of the sound. We moved slowly, cautiously, towards the large stone. As we got closer, the moaning stopped. The only sound was the crunch of our shoes on the gravel path. We reached the tombstone. It was tall and old, with the name Elijah Black carved into it, along with dates from the late 1800s. There was nothing behind it, just more tombstones and shadows. "See?" "Nothing," Ben said, trying to sound relieved. "Just the wind playing tricks." But we weren't convinced. The moaning had sounded too real, too close. We stood there for a moment, listening. The silence was heavy again, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Then, we heard a new sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was gently knocking on wood. It seemed to be coming from the ground, somewhere beneath our feet. We looked at each other, our faces illuminated by the pale moonlight and the beams of our flashlights. This couldn't be the wind. The tapping continued, steady and soft. It felt deliberate, like someone was trying to get our attention. "What is that?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. No one had an answer. We just stood there, frozen, listening to the strange tapping sound coming from the earth. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed felt even more unsettling than the noise had been. Then, we heard something else. A faint whisper, so soft we could barely make it out. It sounded like it was coming from all around us, carried on the still air. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I think so," I said, my voice barely a croak. It sounded like whispering. We strained our ears, trying to catch the words, but it was just a low murmur, like many voices speaking at once, too quiet to understand. The whispering grew louder, swirling around us. It felt cold, like a draft even though there was no wind. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Then, The whispers started to sound like words, but they weren't in English. It was a language we didn't recognize, a series of guttural sounds and hisses that sent a shiver down our spines. "This isn't right," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to get out of here." We started to back away slowly, keeping our flashlights pointed around us. The whispering seemed to follow us, the strange words swirling in the darkness. As we moved, we started to see things in the shadows. Fleeting shapes, dark figures that seemed to flicker at the edge of our vision. Every time we turned our lights towards them, they would disappear, melting back into the darkness behind the tombstones. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It felt like we were surrounded by unseen eyes, listening to the strange whispers, moving in the shadows. Then, one of the tombstones near us started to shake. It was a small, old stone, and it wobbled back and forth for a few seconds before settling back into place. We all gasped. That couldn't have been the wind. There was no wind. Panic started to set in. We turned and ran, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we stumbled through the graveyard. The whispering seemed to get louder as we ran, the strange language echoing in our ears. We could hear other sounds now too. Soft footsteps behind us, like someone was following us through the grass. We didn't dare to look back. We ran towards the gate, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows seemed to move around us, the tombstones looking like grasping hands in the moonlight. As we reached the gate, we fumbled with the latch, our fingers shaking with fear. Finally, it gave way, and we burst out of the cemetery and onto the quiet street. We didn't stop running until we were far away, back in Ben's car, our hearts pounding in our chests. We sat there for a long moment, catching our breath, the silence inside the car a stark contrast to the eerie sounds of the graveyard. What was that? Chloe finally managed to say, her voice still trembling. No one had an answer. We had all heard and seen things that night that we couldn't explain. The scraping, the moaning, the tapping, the whispering, the shaking tombstone, the figures in the shadows. It felt like the dead had been trying to communicate with us, or maybe something even darker. We never went back to that cemetery at night. We still hung out sometimes, but always in the daytime, when the sun was shining and the place felt peaceful again. But even then, there was always a little part of me that remembered the darkness, the whispers, and the feeling that we had disturbed something that night, something ancient and unknown that resided among the graves. The graveyard at midnight was no longer just a creepy place, it was a place where something real, something terrifying, had made itself known. And the silence of the day could never fully erase the memory of the sounds we heard in the dark.